We were able to capture a pretty good video last week. A little blurb in it, but they're looking a lot better. Today we are speaking about the end of Saul's life, and it's time to reflect a little bit. The book of 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, and 2 Kings. What do you want, Tilly? Oh. Those four books are one book. 1 Samuel covers basically the kingdom of Saul. 2 Samuel covers the kingdom of David. And then 1 and 2 Kings covers the descendants of David. 1 and 2 Chronicles cover the same time period of 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings, but written from a different perspective. So we come to the place now, the last verses in 1 Samuel, and it tells us the death of Saul. And so there are some things that are relatable, I think, to us in the 21st century. First of all, if you are indeed listening online, would you please consider making a donation? We would appreciate that. And if you are watching the video online, please subscribe to the video and like it. And if you want to make a comment or something like that, if you want to disagree with some point, or if you want to agree with some point, or if you have something else to add, please feel free to do that. I've entitled this sermon, The End. Go ahead, please. And one more. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines, and many fell on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. Now, you'll remember that David wanted to go up with them, or maybe he didn't want to go up with it. He was scheduled to go up with the Philistines to fight, and the Philistine king said, no, you can't come with us, we don't trust you. And so David was sent back to Ziklag, and when he got there, he found out that the Amalekites had come in and dragged all the people away and took all their stuff. And so David went and chased them. He inquired of God. He prayed. He went to the priest, and the priest threw the lots, and they went and they captured everything, and they brought it back, not just their stuff, but all the other stuff that the Amalekites had raided, and they gave it back to the people in the area. And so that seems to have only taken a couple of days for that to happen. And in the meantime, Saul is in the north, in the valley of Jezreel, which you can see there. Hopefully you can see it here. The valley of Jezreel, and the battle goes wrong, and the Philistines chase Saul and his kids up onto Mount Gilboa, and the archers up there stick them with arrows, and they are killed. Now this is the summary, but the next verses tell us exactly how that happened. Next slide, please. The battle pressed hard upon Saul. The archers found him. He was badly wounded by them. Then Saul said to his armor bearer, draw your sword and thrust me through with it, so that these uncircumcised may not come and thrust me through and make sport of me. But his armor bearer was unwilling, for he was terrified. So Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. So we have, in the end, a suicide. Now, suicide is so unnecessary. And if indeed you have suicidal thoughts, give me a call. We'll get you some help. But this man had come to the place where there was nothing left for him. He had been shot by arrows, and obviously He's in a place with just his armor bearer. So he's run up the mountain out of the valley of Jezreel, and he's laying there dying, and he doesn't want the Philistines to do to him what the Philistines are often apt to do. And so he wants out, and he falls on his own sword. So a very sad end to a guy who spent his whole life trying to keep control of his kingdom, and in the end he loses it. Yet David is still alive. Next slide, please. So now here we have a summation. When his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor bearer and all his men died together on the same day. Yuck. The kingdom is gone. Their lives are gone. They all died on the same day, just like Samuel said when he was called up from the dead. He said, you'll be with me tomorrow. You'll be in the place of the dead tomorrow, and your son's with you. And that's exactly what happened. Very sad. So that's the end for King Saul. It's over. Where did he go? What if the people of Israel had not rejected God and demanded a king? These are questions we have to ask based on what we've seen over the last 10 or 11 months when we'll be looking at this. They had come, they said, we want a king like the other nations who can fight our battles. And Samuel said, no, that's not good. And they bugged him and bugged him and bugged him. And finally God said, you can give them the king, but you got to warn them what's going to happen if they have a king. He's going to do this and this and this and this and this, and you're not going to like it. No, we have to have a king. What if the people hadn't asked for a king? I mean, most of the narratives that we've talked about in the last several months would not have happened. What if King Saul had followed the directive of Samuel and conquered the Amalekites early on in his regency? Who was it that dragged David's family away? The Amalekites. Yeah, move it up one, please. There's a what if slide there. Is it the next one? Okay, I'm assuming she's a mind reader. What if King Saul had followed the directive of Samuel and conquered the Amalekites? The whole raid would have been unable to have been accomplished by the Amalekites, and David would not have had to go down there and fight them. What if King Saul was not jealous of David and appreciated his military expertise and obvious bravery? What if David was, like he was in the beginning, a brave warrior who led into battle and the people were glad to follow him? And the people that were around said, oh, he's really, really good. Saul's killed his thousands, but David is 10,000s. What if that didn't irritate Saul to the point where he wanted to get rid of him? What if Saul recognized that as being profitable for his military? What if King Saul had not killed the priests who were praying for him? So this guy, he's messed up. The only priest left is David's, Ahimelech. David's, he's with David all this time because Saul wanted to kill him too. What if King Saul had not driven David and his soldiers out of Israel into the land of the Philistines? What if David was treated as an honored commander who fought with Saul, his father-in-law, and Jonathan, his best friend, against the Philistines at Mount Gilboa and the valley of Jezreel? What if that contingent of the army was with them instead of sent off to some other place by circumstances, which were largely caused by Saul's actions. What if there was actually a smooth transition of kings upon the natural death of Saul? Jonathan had said to David, "You'll be the next king, I'll be second in command to you." So Jonathan would be alive, and the other people would be alive, and there would be a smooth transition, but there was not, and it was largely because of the jealousy of Saul. This is kind of a wrap-up of the whole life of Saul. Next slide, please. Now, did it have to be that way? Ezekiel says this, and it says conversely the opposite as well, but I didn't take time to put that in there. If the wicked turn away from all their sins they have committed and keep all my statutes and do what is lawful and right, they shall surely live, they shall not die. Throughout his life, Saul had the opportunity to turn away from his sins and do the right thing, but he never did. None of the transgressions that they've committed shall be remembered against them. For the righteousness that they have done, they shall live. Have I any pleasure in the death of the wicked, says the Lord God, and not rather that they should turn from their ways and live? This is not God's plan for Saul. God had better plans for him. And he wants people to turn away from their sin while there's still a chance. It says in one of the Proverbs, when there's life, there is hope. Anybody, if you look online and you see Michael Francesi, who was a gangster in New York and went to prison for 10 years for being a mobster and screwed the state of New York out of millions of dollars in tax money, and then when he gets out of prison, he becomes a Christian, and now he's a pastor, and he's working with gangs in the cities and telling them not to get involved in that kind of life. And he was a made man in the mafia, and to become a made man in the mafia, you got to do some pretty nasty things, including murder. Although he never admitted to that, but we know that that's the entrance to become a made man in the mafia. So he spent all that time in his evil, and then all of a sudden he turned from it, and he can receive forgiveness. Now the converse is also said here in Ezekiel 18, if you want to take a look at it. It says, if somebody does righteousness, and then they turn and do wickedness, none of their righteousness will be remembered. So it's a two-way street. It's how you end up in the end is what the judgment will be. Next slide, please. So what's the result? The North Israelites lost their land and became refugees. It says in 31:7, when the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley and those beyond the Jordan saw that the men of Israel had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they forsook their towns and fled, and the Philistines came and occupied them. This is an editor's note from a historical perspective. They didn't move, people didn't run right out of there immediately and never come back, and the Philistines didn't move in that day. But in the course of time, the territory was lost to the Philistines because of the defeat of the army of Saul. So that's just an editor's note. It's not in the narrative, and it's not in the action verses of this passage, but this is what happened. Who gets the land? The victor. Why are we sitting here on Seneca land? Because our ancestors won the war. And there's not much that can be done about it. Next slide. Now we get back to the narrative. 1 Samuel 31, 8 and 9. When the Philistines came to strip the dead, you don't leave anything, because there might be some silver coins, or there might be a dagger, or there might be something of it. There might be a pair of shoes, clothing. There's things found on the dead bodies that they can use, and it's not like they can go to J.C. Penney's and get a new shirt in those days. And so the first thing they would do is go in and take all the weapons, take all the clothes, and whatever it is the people had, they would that's part of the spoils. So they come in and they find Saul and his 3 sons there on the mountain, and they cut off his head. Pretty barbarous, would you agree? They stripped off his armor, and he sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news, which would be, if we were going to translate that, and if it was the Greek language and it said good news, it would say, carry the gospel to the houses of their idols and to the people. So they're having a military parade, and they have Saul's head on a stick, and his armor, they're carrying his armor and his greaves and whatever it is that he had on to protect himself, because that kind of armor cannot protect you really. I mean, you can put Kevlar vest on, and if they shoot you in the right spot, they're going to be okay, but if they get you in the head, there's not much could be done. I have a Kevlar vest, they told me. If anybody is coming against you, make sure that you're facing them, because there's no protection here. And in order to move your arms in the old armor, there has to be a spot where it's vulnerable. And so the archers had gotten him in that spot. And so they're carrying all these things in. And they take the, next slide please. They take the armor and they put it in the temple of Astarte. Now you'll remember in the earlier part of this book where the Philistines won, they brought the Ark of the Covenant and they put it in the temple of Dagon. And Dagon fell over, remember? And the second time he fell over, it broke his hands off and broke his head off. But in this case, they took the armor and they put it in the temple of Astarte, which is the female sexual god, which was a common, Baal was the male, and Astarte or Ashtaroth, depending on how it's translated, is the female. And this is these are the fertility gods of the Canaanites, and these are the people that would offer their first child to Baal and Astarte and kill the first child and put them in a jar in the corner of their house. And so they take the armor of Saul, which was not able to protect him, and they put it in the temple of this god. So, next slide, please. When the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard that what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men set out and traveled all night long and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan, and they came to Jabesh and they burned them there. Now, this is very unusual. You don't find cremation. It wasn't really within their culture to do that, but it perplexes the scholars why they did that. And they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh. Now, why did the Jabesh Gilead people do this? You will remember earlier, way back, as we were talking about this book, the enemies came and they said to the people of Jabesh Gilead, we will allow you to surrender and live if you allow us to gouge the eye out of one of the men, one eye. And they said, no, we can't do that. We can't submit to that. And they said, well, wait a certain amount of time and we'll tell you if we'll do it. And if we can't find anybody to deliver us, then we will submit to it. And they called for help, and Saul, who was young, said, okay, I'll take care of this. And he took an ox and he cut it into multiple pieces and sent it to the different areas of Israel and said, so shall be done to the people, wherever this piece of meat comes from, if you don't come and save the people of Jabesh Gilead. And so they all got scared, and they all came together, and Saul led them into the war, and they won against the enemy. And the people of Jabesh Gilead were able to keep their land, and they were able to keep their eyes, and they immediately said, who said Saul shouldn't be our king? Because there were people there that saying Saul shouldn't be the king. And let's cut them up, or let's kill them. And Saul said, no. There's been a great victory today. We're not going to kill anybody. And then they went together with Samuel, and they, for the second time, anointed him as the king. Do you remember talking about this? And so the people of Jabesh Gilead have a good view of Saul. Somebody will say, well, so-and-so is no good. And many times I've said to them, I've never had any problem with them. They've always been nice to me. So it's a case like that. These people, excuse me. So they took Saul and they buried him. And they fasted 7 days. Why did they do that? Is there anything in, excuse me. Is there anything in the scripture that says you have to fast? The Jews only had to fast 1 day. And that was on the Day of Atonement. It's the only prescribed fast. And does it mean that they fasted 24 hours a day? Or, thank you very much. You are an awesome daughter. Fasting in the East is still this way. When Islamic people fast, they fast from the morning until night. And then they eat at night. So it was like that. It wasn't a 24-hour, 7-day fast. And they buried him under the tamarisk tree. Now you'll remember in several stories, could you give me a Kleenex there too, please? Thanks. In several stories, we had seen Saul. Oh, but that sounds nice online. How do you like that? In several of the stories, we see Saul underneath one of these tamarisk trees with the spear in his hand. The battle's going on around, and so they had a discussion, where should we bury this guy? And somebody must have said, well, he always hung out under those trees for shade, and so why don't we bury him under there, which is what they did. So they honored him, but they honored him because he was their hero, and they didn't care about all this other stuff. But God cared about it. Okay, I already mentioned this. Got that back in the day slide up. Next one. I just mentioned this, but go ahead to the next slide, please. Second Samuel chapter 1, verse 1. After the death of Saul, when David had returned from defeating the Amalekites. See, these are contemporaneous things that are occurring. David remained 2 days in Ziklag. I don't know where he stayed. I mean, he must have pitched another tent because they'd burned the place down. On the third day, a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. And when he came to David, he fell to the ground and did obeisance. And David said, "Where have you come from?" And he said, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." And David said, "How did things go? Tell me. Tell me." He answered, "The army fled from the battle, but also many of the army fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan also died." Do you have a best friend? His best friend's gone. It doesn't mention the other two sons, which are mentioned in the previous chapter, that they're dead as well. But Jonathan's death is presented to David. And we're going to see in the days ahead how David responded to this, because his response was unlike any response I've ever seen at the death of a best friend and at the death of an enemy, which was Jonathan's father. What do you have to say? What happened to Tally? Well, how does this strike you? Particularly, how about the what if aspect of it?
Why do you think Jonathan was willing to acquiesce? Did he not want to be king?
He apparently didn't want to be. Would you want that job? Thankless? You know, why would anybody want to be president of the United States? Half the people hate you. The other half think you might be better than the other guy. That's all it is, really. Maybe it was because he had such great respect for David. I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know. It just doesn't seem like there's anyone on the planet that would be like that. I could see you abdicating for one of your family members, but not abdicating for your brother-in-law.
What's the matter with your brother-in-law?
He's not here, so it's okay.
Anyone else?
As far as the bodies being burned, it could have very easily been that they were just so badly mutilated and the stench from it that, they felt best that, they had to do it that way. It was probably more of a practical type of burial under the circumstances rather, and in some cultures it's just the way they do it.
Yeah, but it's not, that is further east, that is the way that it's been done, but it's not historically been done among Jewish people. In fact, they have coffins or caskets that have holes in them, and so that the casket will rot with their body in it. They don't embalm. The body goes back to the earth just as soon as possible. So it's not in the culture to do that, so it's very unusual. So it must have been some reason. Cremation isn't actually a Christian thing. No extra charge for that. But there is an extra charge for burial. Anyone else?
So, we don't have the opportunity typically to look back on our lives and do such a long, impactful what if, right? I mean, we do, but God's given us this book to show us what happens when we don't listen to Him. The ramifications to other people You know, when you listed the what ifs, you know, how many battles were fought that didn't need to be fought? How many people died that didn't need to die? If the people of Israel had not asked for a king, and if Saul was the king he should have been, you know, that in this instance, the ramifications were huge for nations, but it's also for us as well to see, you know, we should be seeking God and doing God's will and not our will. And there are ramifications when you don't.
Well, it does apply to our own lives because, you know, wisdom is the ability to see what the possibilities are based upon our action. Like, I think I'll drive 100 miles an hour. I mean, wisdom should say it's a pretty dangerous thing to do, but people do it. Or, I don't think it's necessary to raise my kids to be Christians. I'm going to let them make their own choice when they grow up. That can be really a bad situation. I think I'm going to do this or that at work. I think I'm going to steal some money from work. You know, you might get away with it, but they're going to catch you eventually, and the ramifications are going to be horrendous. You're going to lose your job, you could lose your house, you could lose your marriage. But people sometimes don't think about what it is. And Saul's whole problem was that he was jealous of David. And if he had just harnessed it, it would have been helpful.
And going back to what we talked about months ago, we are still the ones that want to set ourselves up as king, either personally or we think if only our party is in charge of the government, then everything will be all right. Then we can really get this country back to where God intended it to. You know, President X will be our savior instead of Jesus will be our savior. And we push it away so that we shirk our responsibility for what we need to do in our lives.
Yeah, if there's any lesson in 1 Samuel is that it doesn't matter if you're talking about Saul or David. They both do horrendous things. Actually, we have time. I'm done early, believe it or not.
There was a thing on PBS years ago, and I think about it all the time, and it was designated for children, but it was like a little boy who had a balloon, and he popped the balloon, and it showed that somebody got scared and they fell on a skateboard, and then the skateboard went down the stairs, and then the person got hurt. You know, it showed the ramifications of this little practical joke, and that has stayed with me all these years as an adult, that the decisions that you are about to make, you need to look at the what if. If I make this decision, what are going to be the consequences or the ramifications of that decision that I'm going to make, and how is it going to affect the people around me? And it was on PBS, and it was a kids thing, but it's something that's always stuck with me over these years.
A kid show with a moral in it. Unbelievable. Anyone else? Well, we find out here that this person who comes with the news from Mount Gilboa is in fact an Amalekite. David has just fought the Amalekites a couple days previously. And do you know what this Amalekite has in his hand? He has Saul's diadem and his jeweled bracelet. I guarantee you that the person who has the diadem in the jewel bracelet is the first person on scene. He presents these to David. And what does David do? He kills him. Next week we'll talk about that. May God bless. If you need prayer, we'll be glad to pray for you. Only took 10 months to get through 1 Samuel. Hopefully we can get through 2 Samuel and 8. God bless you. We'll see you.